Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Orozco, and this is my partner, Veronica. We are the co-founders of Ehecatl Philosophies, and this is our first podcast. And so this is our initial podcast. So we're going to basically introduce ourselves, who we are individually, um, our backgrounds and our upbringings, and the main question that we're going to discuss and talk about today is, when we came into consciousness uh, about social justice issues and ethnic studies and our identity and our positions and our own biases and whatnot. So we're going to share our stories, and then you're more than welcome to comment or send us what you think. But this is the start of something for us and for you, and hopefully you can follow us on this journey as we move forward. So I'm going to start by introducing the co-founder of Ehecatl Philosophies and my life partner, Veronica, who is an adjunct professor at Cal State Channel Island. She's a traditional Aztec Mexica dancer for over 20 years. She was a teacher for many years, for first grade, I believe. And she's been a community activist in Ventura for over 20 years. And recently they just removed a statue, a symbolism of systemic oppression, the statue of Father Sarah in front of City Hall. So that was a huge battle that Veronica led, and along with the coalition of others, to remove that and begin the dismantling of what we see as a systemic oppression. So the question that I asked to my partner is when did you tell us a little bit about your background, tell everybody a little bit about your background, and then when did you come into consciousness, as we say?
So I'm a first generation Chicana in the United States, born in the United States. My parents were immigrants from Mexico, from the state of Jalisco. And they came over to California in pursuit of a better life and a better future for their children. They ended up being farm workers and settled in the Santa Maria Valley. So I'm originally from Santa Maria, born and raised on Chumash territory. And as we were growing up there, definitely growing up in poverty in the projects of Santa Maria, growing up as a migrant ed student, growing up and working in the fields in the summers until they outlawed having children on the fields. But that was my upbringing. And really it was about surviving. And I learned a lot about my culture just from the traditions that my family would uphold at home, but I didn't know a lot of our history and the longevity of our people here in the Southwest of the United States. I absolutely didn't know anything about that. I didn't know my indigenous identity. I didn't know the history of Mexico and the history of colonization. I didn't know any of that. And I don't think my parents knew a whole lot either, because growing up in Mexico, neither one of them were able to go to school for very long because they had to help their families work. And that's just what is pretty typical in Mexico, especially during that time. And even now, just keeping in touch with folks out there and family members and just other folks that I'm in touch with. The history in Mexico is also told through a Eurocentric perspective, through a Spanish perspective. So even Mexicanos in Mexico and the Mexican education system, they also don't learn about our indigenous roots or history told through indigenous history. So that was my upbringing. And because I didn't have a stronghold or understanding of who I was, I had a really difficult time accepting who I was and loving myself, especially going through a system and a society that tells us that everything about us is wrong and ugly and lazy and all of these negative stereotypes that we grow up with. And of course, I'm growing up in the projects. And so with poverty, there's a lot of delinquency, there's crime, there's drug abuse, there's alcohol abuse, there's just all of that is wrapped up in the violence that comes with poverty, and that is systemic. And so I was exposed to that and didn't do too well once I got to my adolescent years, and just kind of fell into those traps and bought into those negative stereotypes. I ended up really not doing well in high school. I became a single teenage mother as soon as I graduated. Luckily I did graduate, but I had to go to continuation school first to make up units and then come back and graduate. So it was tough. And my experience in school, again, I didn't learn anything about my identity. I wasn't taught to be proud of myself or my cultural background. There weren't a whole I don't remember teachers or even counselors that were trying to keep me on the right path. It was just whatever happened to me happened. It was the norm. And so, but I know that getting pregnant at such a young age was a really, really big challenge. But at the same time, it's what helped me get myself together, and it's what made me become more determined to do something with myself, because now I had this whole other life that I was responsible for. So that was a blessing for me, and that's what I needed to get my head straight. And so my son was born in the summer, so I took that first semester off, and then I went to community college, Ehecatl College in Santa Maria. Once I was there, I came across an old friend of mine that I've known since elementary school, Veronica, and she was involved in Mecha. And so she asked me to come to the meetings and to become a Mechista. And so I did that. And so when I became a Mechista, that was my first time to become aware of the social injustices around me. And I came to understand that the systemic oppression that was purposefully created is what put my family and myself in the situation that we were in. And it isn't to say, well, it's only the system's fault and we shouldn't have to take responsibility. Of course, we should all take responsibility as individuals, but it's really difficult to take responsibility if you don't understand the entire matrix of what's happening systemically or individually or whatnot. So that really helped me understand and really helped me begin my healing journey, and to forgive myself for a lot of things, and to really forgive even my family. Not that they were at fault so much, but I felt like this grudge because of the situation that we were in. But I understood at a much larger systemic level the microaggressions and the macroaggressions that are imposed on marginalized communities and how that affects us. And so that understanding really, really, really helped me develop my consciousness, my conciencia. And so I continued to be a Mechista, became vice president of Mecha. And I began to really do well in school, because I understood what was at stake, and I understood that it really, really mattered that I push beyond those barriers and the stereotypes. And so I ended up transferring, not knowing that I could even transfer. I'm the first in my family to go to a 4-year university. I didn't really understand the process, but thankfully the counselors at the EOP office helped me, and they got me on the right track. I transferred to UCSB, where I majored in Chicana and Chicano studies, further developing my consciousness, because once you're at a university or a college and you get involved with student groups, then you become even more politicized, and especially majoring in Chicana and Chicano studies. So I became very, very politicized. I became very active on my campus, and that was the same time where I discovered danza, and I joined a danza group in Santa Barbara. And so I was able to delve much deeper into the history of our people through an indigenous lens through danza, and understand my indigeneity as a Mexica woman through danza. And even though there were sprinkles of that at the university through the Chicana Chicano Studies program, there's nothing like learning it, from elders, from practicing the tradition and the ceremonies. There's nothing like that in just meeting a ton of people. And so that was like earning a whole other degree, but like within the community, right? Within the grassroots movements. And so I was learning and growing in both of these sectors. Eventually I moved over to Ventura because Santa Barbara is much too expensive to stay in, and I earned my multiple subject teaching credential, and I began teaching at Montalvo Elementary in Ventura as a first grade dual immersion teacher. And I absolutely wanted to be an educator because I felt like that was the answer. Education is the answer. And if these little students, these little children had the type of education that I yearned for my entire life, then I would be making an impact in that way. And so I began my teaching career in the year of 2001. That was the year of 9/11, and so that was really scary right at the beginning of the school year as a brand new teacher. And so, you know, we began to, I had to like really be critical about what's going on in the world and what's going on within our government, and et cetera. But bringing it back into the classroom, I knew that it had to be very culturally relevant. And so I was basically teaching ethnic studies at the elementary school level since the very beginning, because I had such a strong background in my Chicano studies. And even within that major, I took Asian studies, Black studies, women's studies. And so it was really well-rounded. Eventually, within the school system, I began to understand that systemically, we weren't serving students of color the way that we should be. As system-wide, it wasn't culturally relevant. I did try to address these things on my campus and district-wide. I received some support in some areas and not so much in other areas. I began to push for ethnic studies in the year 2009. I was pushing for a Chicano studies class at Ventura High School, and that was pretty much turned down. And at that point, I decided to go back to school, and I went and earned my master's degree in Chicano studies at CSUN. And while that was happening, that's when the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona, and everything that they were going through out there, that's when that was happening. So as soon as I graduated, I brought it back to Ventura Unified, but by then there was much more awareness and support across the state of California because of what happened in Arizona. And so now we had a group of people to organize and push for it. And so we continued to do that and push for that. By that time, I was teaching at Cal State Channel Islands, Chicano Studies. And so we organized. And so thankfully now we have passed a resolution in Ventura where it's a TK through 12 ethnic studies, ethnic and social justice studies program. And so we're still developing that. Along the way, thankfully, Gabriel and I reconnected. We've known each other for many years through the tradition of danza. Didn't see each other for a long time, and then we saw each other again and found out that we were both on the same path as far as social justice and education. And so when we came together, we decided to put our talents together and work for social justice and education at a much larger systemic level. But we'll talk about that at our next session. And so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce my partner here, Gabriel Orozco, who has been a very long time educator, has taught at all grade levels, special ed, general, regular education, from elementary all the way to adult ed, you name it, he has taught it, and he's really good at what he does. He's also a school board member of Pico Rivera, El Rancho Unified School District, which is the first district that made ethnic studies a graduation requirement in the state of California. He's also been a danzante for over 20 years, 24 years, around there. And so we walk this path together as partners. And so he brings a lot of that passion and that understanding of indigeneity and how that can rehumanize the classroom, because we're talking about the whole student, and how to address social emotional learning and special ed needs, and et cetera, et cetera. So I present to you my partner, Gabriel Orozco, and asking you the same question. What was your journey in coming into consciousness? How did you get to where you are now?
Thank you, Francisco Mate, my partner. Well, for me, my story's the same but different. I'm a third generation Chicano, and my great grandmother came over during the Revolution of Mexico. So that's how long my family's been in this country. My grandfather served in World War II. My dad served in Vietnam. So I'm third generation. I don't say I'm bilingual. I say I'm very good at Spanglish. But my upbringing was a little different in the sense that, and I am also part Korean. You know, I'm half Korean. My mother is full Korean. But I was raised by my Mexican grandparents here, and I was raised under an assimilationist model. You know, my grandparents went through a lot of discrimination when they were growing up. You know, not allowed to speak Spanish, being paddled when they were Spanish, and just totally being pushed to strip them of their identity. So they in turn didn't want their children to go through that, and I'm their great grandchild. So So my journey is a little different, but it's the same in the sense that the systemic racism is prevalent. You know, I was a smart kid, gate kid, um, and then I started making a lot of mistakes in high school, uh, in making a lot of bad decisions. I was not going to school. I was involved in activities that led me to a place that I should not have been. But that was systemic. And in high school, you know, I would ditch class, and I was doing drugs and doing things that I shouldn't have been doing. And I was never approached by a counselor or a teacher, or not one person at any of the schools that I went to. And I went to 5 different high schools. None of them were able to spot me or ask me or develop any relationship with me whatsoever in the high school, at the high school level. And I went to 5 different high schools, and I never graduated high school. I actually ended up dropping out, um, and don't have a GED or diploma. So for me, my saving grace was when I went to Rio Hondo College, and I just started going to school. And then I actually, one summer, I took a Chicano studies class, and it really opened my eyes. So I wouldn't even have said what I just said about my grandparents if I hadn't taken that class, and it didn't force me to look at my own life and like, oh wow, okay, so I'm a Chicano. Wow, okay, what does that mean? What does that stand? What does that place me? I should say. What do I stand with that? So I started learning about being a Chicano with the letter C, the CH, in terms of being Mexican American. And then I started getting active at Rio Hondo. I started doing student body, you know, as president of the Honor Society. And I was doing AIDS Awareness Week, and it was, you know, when Magic Johnson announced he had HIV. So I was very active that way, but I was politically active, but I wasn't politically active in terms of identity. It wasn't until I transferred to USC that identity played a much bigger role for me. So the Chicano Studies class opened my eyes. And then when I went to USC, it was like, oh, yes, you are a minority. You are a very small minority at this school. And so I ran into a lot of racism at the school, from classmates, from fraternity people who did not know what they were talking about. Um, and campus security that would, you know, if I would go walk to the computer lab and I happen to be wearing my grandfather's flannel and I was wearing a hat, which I did a lot in the evening, I would get pulled over by campus security, and I had to make sure, you know, I had my ID and where others were able to go. So I started a political action committee called La Raza Political Action Committee. And so we worked in conjunction with NECHA, but our focus was after Cesar Chavez passed away, we were going to create a big Chicano Latino mural and rename a park after Cesar Chavez at USC. Well, USC was not okay with that. So we organized a series of protests. And we never actually got the park, and we never got the mural. After a series of protests and writing resolutions, they ended up waiting us out. We met with the vice president, then we met with the president. And what was very disappointing to me, and shows to the systemic racism, very prevalent at USC and at, you know, our educational system in general, is that all the president would say is that we were lucky to even be in the room with him. Those were his comments. Like, I don't meet with students. You know, I don't normally meet with students. And so from that led to me graduating with a degree in finance. And then I went and got a master's degree in education. I got a multiple subject credential. And I started teaching because, like my partner here, Veronica, I thought education was the way to go. What's going to have the biggest impact on our community? What's going to make the biggest change? And so I thought that teaching was it. And I came back to my hometown and I began teaching. And I started teaching about the real stories of Christopher Columbus, basically doing like ethnic studies for 5th grade. And then I became involved with danza, with Aztec dance. And that's where my identity grew from a Chicano with the CH to being a Chicano with an X, which is understanding and learning more about my indigenous side, my indigeneity, and how that reflects in who I am and how it reflects in where I want to go. And so learning about danza helped me start centering on, okay, so what's happening in the world today? And it made me reflect on my own life as well, taking Chicano studies and going to danza and starting learning about colonization, more specific colonization, more about what a strong and beautiful people we come from in terms of our indigenous heritage. And so once I started doing danza and I was teaching, well, you know, radical, crazy teacher. And so, unfortunately, that kind of teacher activist is not necessarily welcome. So I ended up leaving that school district, and I went to another school district and waited till I was tenured. And I also started danza and was starting to create movement with the students and people in the community. And once again, because it was a little too radical for them, I ended up leaving that school district. And so all of my experiences and my own personal experiences and understanding how when I went away on vacation, it was mostly black and brown that were incarcerated, and there were more people of color in the juvenile delinquent system than there were at USC or the university levels that I had attended. And so those things led to been doing this for 20 something years, going to protests and supporting social justice. And then ethnic studies comes out. Someone asked me to run for the school board. I run, I get in, trying to make very progressive changes within the city. And then my daughter had her trecena ceremony, and I had to go and meet some people, and I ran into Veronica, and then we became friends again. And then we decided to put our talents together and combine our forces and create this company called Ehecatl Wind Philosophies to further the cause. Meaning, we want to impact, or I'll speak for myself, I want to have impact in the communities. And besides being a teacher, what's a bigger scope? I ran for school board, but that's finite, And so then we created this company because we want to help those who are impacting our communities as well. So we can train people, we can lend all of our experience and expertise in our areas that we're experts in terms of classroom, in terms of cultural competency, and the biggest one is ancestral knowledge and indigenous epistemologies. But understanding how these things will impact our students, how powerful it is when we do these things. When I had my Chicano studies class last year, the kids were just hungry for the knowledge that we were handing out. High school juniors, they were just hungry for it. And so we're very passionate about this because we know the impact it has. And for me, I don't think I could have picked a better partner. And we don't, when we talk amongst ourselves, we think it was just a coming that was going to happen, that the universe, she likes to say, the universe brought this all together. And so that's why we created this company. We've been around. We created it in 2017. We spent 2018 just basically, getting everything ready, preparing ourselves, making it into a legitimate business. And we have a few contracts. And so now we want to continue to the distance learning, but I think people need to know what drives us to do this. And it's community, love of community, a love of self, and trying to move our communities forward in the best way we know how is through education and the training that we offer, but also because we're very experienced, you know, and I like to say that we're very down to earth and we're very real. And I think that's the difference. It's what drives me and makes me passionate. But it was that first Chicano studies class that I took at Rio Hondo College that, you know, created a spark. It didn't explode at that moment, but it did drop a seed in me and led to other movements and organizations into where we're at now.
And we want to share this with you so that you all get to know us a little bit better, but also so that we have this understanding. And I think there's so many people who have had similar experiences that we have, as far as not really learning about yourself in school, and the curriculum and the pedagogical approaches not being centered on the students or on the community, and so we didn't see ourselves in the curriculum. So everybody, like so many people, have experienced that, and there are a lot of amazing social justice educators out there and professors and whatnot who have shared their stories, but this is all to say that we all have this understanding that the educational system as it is right now is not serving the students that need it the most. And that's a lot of students. In California alone, the majority of our students are brown students. The vast majority of our students are brown students, and the teacher demographics don't reflect that. The authors and the authors of books and the characters of books don't reflect that. Our libraries don't reflect that. Our administrators don't reflect that. So we have a long way to go. And when we talk about how in the past we were radical teachers, it was radical for that time. And now we see so many teachers doing the work that we were trying to do way back, and it was, you know, we were shunned for it. But now people are coming to understand and realize that that's the kind of radical and revolutionary type of teaching that is necessary in order to reach our students, to validate our students, to let our students know that they are loved, that they matter to us, and that we want them to learn and become lifelong learners and not just push them through the system. And so it is necessary to be radical. And so when we talk about what is radical and what is revolutionary, that doesn't mean there isn't anything negative to that. What that really means is doing something out of the ordinary, not doing the same old thing. And why would we when we know it doesn't work, right? That is the definition of insanity. So we're not going to do that. We know it doesn't work. It hasn't worked for a very, very long time. And so we have to think outside of the box and do things differently. And right now, with the momentum, Black Lives Matter, and everything that has happened with this pandemic, and people coming to consciousness, I think right now, large numbers of people coming to consciousness and really seeing for the first time what many of us have seen for many years, the injustices that are embedded in our system. And we don't want to go back to ignoring those injustices. We want to build something better out of this. We don't want to go back to the normal. We have to move forward in a way that is revolutionary, and always understanding that the work that we do is rooted in love. It's rooted absolutely in love. It's not rooted in hate for an oppressor or anything like that. It's rooted for the love of people, so that we can move forward and build a better society for all the generations to come. Because I think that we have endless number of testimonies that will say that the system has produced a lot of turmoil for the majority of people, at least people of color and other marginalized communities. And so we have to change that.
So I'll ask you, Veronica, how was your family when you were going through all these epiphanies? What was your family support like?
You know, my family, I think, had a hard time grasping it in some ways, and sometimes I feel like they kind of still do, but they've tried to support me because they know that I've gone through so much in my life personally. And so when they saw that that I'm doing things for myself and growing positively out of a negative background, then they wanted to support that. They don't necessarily understand all the politics that I'm involved in, or they're not in the world of education, they're not in the world of politics, and a lot of people aren't. And so they have a hard time grasping, but I think that they also try to support, and, at least they support in the way of not telling me not to do what I'm doing. In the beginning, I kind of got a little bit of that from my mom. And that was really interesting for me because she saw how active I was in the community, and she wanted me to just focus on, getting my career, focus on being a mom, focus on being home, don't be out there, but I had to explain to her, like, everything that I'm doing is for my children and everybody else's children. And it is a sacrifice, but I had my children with me as I was doing those things, and they learned along the way too. So that was difficult, but at the same time, I had to remind my mom, and thank you for asking this, because she was an activist herself, and I don't know that she ever saw herself as that, but she was an activist, and she politicized me as a child, but I didn't connect it until later. Because my mom, being a farm worker, she was very much involved in the UFW in Santa Maria. And she would take me to the UFW meetings, and I was just a kid. She just didn't have anybody to take care of me, so I was stuck going to the meetings with her. But the impact that it had on me, I still remember, just in the corner as they're talking and having their meetings. I'm off on the corner where all the toys are at. But I remember those meetings, and it stayed with me and it impacted me. And she just shared a story with me just a couple of weeks ago, because I wanted to ask her, so what was it like and what was happening during those times? And, she was sharing with me that they were working with Cesar Chavez, and that's when, they made the short-handed hoe illegal, and kids working in the fields illegal. So I didn't work in the fields after that. But she also talked about how there were a lot of allies that would come and help the UFW, even though they weren't farm workers, and some of those allies being white allies, and that there was a white ally who stayed in our home for about 2 weeks to help with the movement in Santa Maria. And I don't really remember that because I was little, but I think it was just really powerful that my mom opened up our home, and being an activist in that way to just keep the movement going forward. So she had a hard time understanding, but at the same time, when I reminded her of her activism, then it was hard for her to continue to argue against that. And she sees that it makes me happy, that it brings meaning to my life, that it brings purpose to my life. And so she supports it. And so now we have very productive conversations that have to do with a lot of social justice issues. And my mom, still a monolingual immigrant mother from Mexico, is 84 years old. And I love having these conversations with her. Like, she gets it, she understands.
And so I will answer the same question myself. I will say that for me, my grandparents are everything to me. They're no longer with me physically, but I know they're with us spiritually. And their endurement of a lot of that discrimination is what really led me to really look at my family history and look at where that aligns in terms of the general history. My grandparents were hardcore Catholics, hardcore Kennedy Democrats. So I wouldn't say I was politicized, but I knew that we were Democrats. We were Kennedy Democrats. We were not Republican. But my grandfather was, I wouldn't call him an activist, but he was a big time union man. And so when they went on strike, he went on strike, and he was a truck driver. And if there were scabs, they didn't cross the line when he was there. And so my politicizing wasn't really like, oh, here's what this is, you need to do this. It was just listening to their conversations. But when I started becoming active myself, and I started really looking at things critically, I started doing the boycott with Cesar Chavez. I started talking to my grandparents about those issues. I started using the word Chicano a lot more, and then my grandfather would say Chicano every once in a while. And so when I started going off and spending time with different tribes, and I was doing ceremonies with different tribes and going to different lands, they would ask my family, like, where's Gabriel? Like, Gabriel, where is he? Oh, he's in the mountains somewhere with some Indians.
That's what they would say about me.
Yeah, he's somewhere out there. We don't know. And then when I was protesting that, oh, he's somewhere in the streets. He's probably causing trouble somewhere. We don't know,
Yeah.
And so I was kind of ostracized in my family because I'm the crazy radical one. What do you know? But throughout the years, and I've become more educated, quote unquote. Like my dad sees things differently now, and my cousins and my aunt, who like Veronica's family, they don't really understand everything. They just see like the big concepts, like that's right, that's wrong, that's racist. Like nobody's gonna argue what happened with George Floyd. That was completely racist. The hard part they have is understanding systemic racism and systemic oppression, because those are so embedded in the day-to-day sometimes that we don't even see it. And so that's for me in my family. I was just the crazy Indian guy. But now that it's not a fad or it's not a phase, and my children have been raised in our indigenous way. Both of my children have Nawa names. Teo Cuautzin, my son, Huitzitlán is my daughter. And so I think that was really when my grandparents and all the families and the families of my ex-wife, because they were like, why are you naming them this? Can you give them a Catholic name? Can you baptize them in the Catholic Church? And I did none of that. My kids were baptized for Shilonen, our ceremony. They will both go through Tresena ceremonies, and they haven't been raised anyway the way I've been raised. And so sometimes my kids think I'm crazy, but I think most of the time they agree with me and understand what I'm about. But we tend to be like when we converse with our families, we have to tone it down a bit, and not be so political or radical. But as we've gotten older and a little more mature and wiser, rather than getting into arguments with our families, it's just better to just, on some things you just kind of lay to the side.
Yeah, and a lot of the times too, it's just about, we can't convince somebody with words, so we're just going to show through our actions and just model it, and I think that both of our families see all the work that we're doing, and with time they've come to understand, accept, and respect the work that we're doing, because we are making a big impact in all the different things that we do, and our family sees that. And so because we've stuck to it for so many years, and they've seen the impact that we've made in various ways, then they've just come to respect that. And so sometimes you can't convince people with words, but you just keep on doing what you're doing and do it in a positive way and show the impact that you're making, and just model it, and they'll come to understand better in those ways. And many times after that, they'll come to you and start to ask you questions. So that's just the way that, we've learned, again, like Gabriel said, with time and wisdom, we just learn to flow in different ways to make that impact possible.
So this is our first podcast, and it's just basically an introduction to Veronica and myself. So you kind of have an idea of where this idea of Ehecatl Wind Philosophies, where it was born and where it comes from, and how we're both very passionate about this work and expanding the work. But we all want you to get to know who we are, at least a little bit of our background, so you understand, why we do what we do. So if you have any questions, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and listen to us, and send us questions and comments, because we really want to hear it, because it's our first one. So.
And for our next episode, we're really going to talk a little bit more about when we actually did come together and build the Ehecatl Wind Philosophies, and the work that we've done so far, and why we're doing that together, and what that's founded on, what our anchors are. So we'll share that with you in episode 2.
And then if you have any suggestions on what you think, or what more you want to learn about us, or what are you doing, or what's happening, please feel free to reach out, and send a comment, and like or subscribe. So, all right, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
First one down.